Okay, good afternoon. Welcome everyone to the second last in our Demystifying Data Masterclass series. So you want the data today with Dr. Mick Cooney of Describe Data. My name is Damien Rosser. I'm the Program and Development Manager for the Centre for Insurance Risk Data Analytics Studies. So if you guys want to know about free and heavily subsidised education solutions from Masterclass through to level 8 and 9 certificates and major awards, chat to myself. I'm joined by Aidan Mahon here of the InsurTech Network Centre. Aidan works with the Enterprise Ireland funded Network Centre, and he will be the person to talk to if you're interested in research and innovation, whether you're an established entity or a startup. So do please get in touch with either of us. A couple of quick housekeeping rules as per normal. Keep your mics on if you can, or off, sorry, if you can, unless you're speaking, and do please get involved in our chat. One further piece of housekeeping, I'm going to pop into the chat the link from the video that Mick was talking about last week in relation to color schemes on data visualizations and the choice around those and some of the things that you may not have factored in previously or that you may not be aware of. A really interesting talk there, about 20 minutes. So I'll pop that in the chat. And without further ado, I'll let Mick take over there now, and I'll pass over to Mick. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Tim. You've saved me doing a Google in there. I just realized it didn't have the link handy. So while you were introducing me, I was going to go search for it. But yeah, like I said, did you watch it, Damien? Since when I said, yeah, it's one of those. It's not really got anything to do with anything specific, but it's kind of useful to know, and it's just a very interesting kind of informal talk where, you know, basically they were trying to come up with a new color scheme, and they were asked MATLAB, which this library was based upon because it's a Python library. They were kind of asked if they could use it, and MATLAB said, no, it's our intellectual property, you know, PFO basically. So they went, fine, we'll create our own one. And it's just talk. And then they also discussed how you could actually choose your own like set of things and how to think about it, and a couple of constraints that in place. So it's from a data visualization point of view, considering what we were talking about last week, it's quite, I just thought it was quite a useful kind of way to think about that. There's a lot going on in this kind of stuff, which is kind of why I really didn't get into too much detail last week. It was kind of I tried to keep things high level, because if I actually went into a lot more detail, I would have only half-assed the job, to be honest. And like I said, as simple as possible, but no simpler. And, you know, the only real way to actually cover anything then is to choose one very simple aspect of it. But anyway, that was last week. So yeah, as Damien mentioned, this is talk 7. We've kind of talked about lots of different things, and to a certain extent, this will probably be me reiterating the same points over and over again in a slightly different context. As you know, as they said about Jurgen Klopp at Liverpool, he was a one-trick pony with a very good trick. And that's pretty much me. It's basically kind of, you know, applying the basic principles of, you know, simplicity and de-risking and stuff overall. But what we're going to talk about today is, you know, getting started. You know, as I like to say, so you want to data, and how do you start getting started is probably the way I'd phrase it. It's not necessarily doing it. It's just the way in which we try to help people, and what I've kind of came across in various guises in insurance since 2014, but I was kind of working in finance before that, and just kind of the things I've observed and the ways in which you take this, because quite often these can be quite very, you know, wishy-washy, nebulous concepts. Matched, you know, as I like to say, the desire to get something done is the only thing that matches the complete level of, you know, lack of clarity in what they want to actually get done. They just know people want something done. They just have no idea what. So quite often I get asked, what do we do? And kind of that's basically what I'm going to talk about today. But like Damien said, please put comments into the chat. I've kind of, the first half of this is a good few slides. I expect the second half basically has 1 or 2 slides, and that's it, because it's largely going to be me just talking about anecdotes and kind of observations I've made that has kind of led to the philosophy I have. So it's not necessarily something that I just kind of invented and then decided to apply to everything. I stepped on an awful lot of rakes, and so I don't necessarily know where they are, but I know what part of the ground looks like where they tend to be, is the way I'd phrase it. So, but I have very much done, if anyone's ever seen that Sideshow Bob cartoon of him walking in a circle from The Simpsons, standing on rakes and getting whacked in the face, that's pretty much a good illustration of my data career in terms of, so it's just kind of talking about those kinds of things and more about why things fail than why things succeed, which is good, because I was actually discussing this with a colleague this morning saying, do we have any outrageous successes? Because I can't think of any, because it's a very obvious thing to accuse me of straight away, is like, it's very easy to know these are why I think fails and here's a method to avoid failure. Well, do you have any examples of success? And I'm like, well, I've got some minor examples of success, but nothing that I could point to, you know, as being absolutely clear cut, definitely a success due to doing what I'm telling you to do or the way I think things should be done. So I should probably throw that up there right at the start. And I'm sure people will say very differently, but to me, what I'm saying makes sense to me, and to avoid the various pitfalls that, you know, I've encountered in the past. So that's kind of where we're going. So I will, enough blather. Let me just maximize the screen here. And yeah, so you want the data. So before we kind of begin, what I kind of want to do is kind of set the scene, because like everything, where you're going is very dependent on where you're starting. So I kind of want to, and I think what I'm describing here to a certain will have, you know, to varying degrees of accuracy is a fairly universal setup. So it's basically that, you know, someone somewhere pretty senior has heard that data is the new oil. They didn't watch my talk where I talked about what that phrase actually meant. They're just reading The Economist. I think I got that from The Economist, actually. That's an Economist article from about 7 or 8 years ago. And apparently data is the new thing, and we need to be doing some of that. So can we have some data, please, is basically, you know, the attitude. And, you know, essentially the downside is, for those of you who don't know your memes, because a lot of people don't, this is Leroy Jenkins, which was one of the first ever internet memes from 2005, I think. And it was actually a joke. It wasn't real, but it was basically set up. It's a thing in World of Warcraft, which is this online game with a load of players. And basically it's sets up with this guy going through this very, very intricate plan with one of the main guys who's AFK, like away from the keyboard, clearly paying no attention. And he spends the first like 40 seconds of the video going through all this technical gobbledygook about what people are going to do. And then this guy basically just comes back, appears on the screen, becomes active, turns on his mic, he shouts, "Leroy Jenkins, let's go," and piles headfirst into the room, and everyone's dead within like 15 seconds. So it's kind of become now a phrase of, you know, what we don't want. It's become a verb, which is probably a good thing and a bad thing, but what you don't want to do is Leroy Jenkins something, which basically suggests go in there with just with this, you know, firm belief that enthusiasm and a desire to do something is the only requirement for success. And I've seen that happen an awful lot, where we're very serious about this. We're going to spend some money, but we want to see progress and we want to get a whole lot of stuff. So let's just start doing stuff and see where we are, you know, in a while. For someone, and what inevitably happens is the whole thing turns into grey goo, and everyone starts blaming everyone else, and the whole thing turns into a failure. And I've seen that happen a lot. In fact, we were in a various thing a couple of years ago at a meeting, and we were discussing a conversation. Sorry, we were kind of, it was a kind of a startup accelerator type thing we were doing, and there was a guy in the audience who was kind of talking. It was kind of it was like a one-day mentor thing, and one guy was part of a design thinking approach, which was this kind of new wave kind of design approach to project management and stuff. It has its good and its bad parts, but he had one very, very interesting anecdote about a survey they did, and what they found was that, first of all, it's kind of a well-known stat that something ridiculous like 90 to 95% of IT projects fail for some definition of failure, like just don't succeed or turn into nothing. And they did this quite extensive survey, digging deeper into the reasons for why these projects would fail. There was all sorts of reasons. Obviously, this was a thing because they were selling these services to try and avoid that. But one of the interesting things that I totally do believe because it just makes a lot of sense when you hear about it. They found that one of the reasons why people were not planning properly, like they were just starting stuff. And one of the reasons is because there's senior management get involved. They get all excited. They kind of start taking personal notice of what's going on. And then they just, because they're kind of excited and enthusiastic, they just want to see progress. So people just start doing stuff. And actually what they found that the way to succeed in these things is to actually do nothing for the first week or two, is to actually stop, take a step back and have a think about what you want to achieve, and then have a bit of a think about, no, not that you sit around drinking coffee and doing, you know, sweet Fanny Adams, but, you know, you sit there and you think about doing stuff, and you know, you measure off the various pros and cons and maybe try a few things, but you don't kind of dive, you don't Leroy Jenkins straight into it, right? And that's always kind of stuck with me. I heard that 3 or 4 years ago, and I have noticed that now that kind of that phenomenon had been pointed out to me, I actually see it quite a lot now. So I'm trying to kind of avoid that. And that is something like, as they know, that key phrase, stakeholder management, that quite often, especially like project sponsor management, is often quite an important precursor, because basically quite quickly you end up with, for those of you who haven't seen this image before, Bacon Studio. You know, it's a complete mess. You know, after a month, you end up with this and no one can find anything, and the whole thing is a complete, you know, disaster. So this is a quote from Winston Churchill, which is a bit, feels a bit weird because I'm Irish, but he did say a few good things. And this is one I definitely believe in. And he says that, this is a full quote actually, which is about war, but I think it's a very universal truth. And when you actually find this quote online, they usually get rid of that first part, which is a great example of, you know, how you can't trust anything you see on the internet. But and this was some kind of relicsworld.com website. It was the only one. The rest, it started at plans are useless, but planning is invaluable. And that's very true. It's kind of like, you know, no plan survives contact with the enemy. And that is very, very true. But the fact that you've actually gone through the process of planning means you've thought about things a bit more, so that when reality comes up and punches you in the face, you're not completely lost. You've actually had a chance to sit down, take stock, think about what you're going to do, and then, you know, and then you're kind of in a position where you can actually start to execute on things. And that's kind of what I want to talk about today, is like, how do we start starting? How do we start to plan, and what are the kinds of approaches we should take, and how do we do that? So, you know, quoting from the Chemical Brothers, you know, where do I begin? What do we do? This is all great, Mick. Totally on board. You've sold me, but what now? You know, how do you actually do it? So the very first thing I always tell people is, like, where are you? Like I said, the only way you can figure out where you're going is, before even you figure out where you want to get to, you have to figure out where you are right now. And in my experience, there's two types of kind of places you can do. We need to kind of assess the current state of the organization. So we need to figure out, you know, what data do we have? What kind of format is it in? Is it being used for anything? If it's being used, what is it being used for? Are there any known issues? How automated is our data curation process? Are there any issues with it? Have you spoken to, like, the IT data team who's responsible for all this stuff? Do you have any engineers in your company? That ties into your capability, right? Do we have very many technical people, or is most of it outsourced? Neither of them are a particular game changer, but you need to kind of understand that to know where your organization can start to kind of do these in the most effective way. Because the worst thing you can do is to not really take into account these things. Get started. Actually, the worst case scenario is not really realize this until 3 or 4 months in, because at that point you've spent 3 or 4 months time and money of the budget realizing that you're flogging a dead horse, because what you're trying to do is kind of at odds with your SLAs, with your vendor providers, who are a critical piece of this puzzle. So you kind of need to know all these. So the first thing you kind of have to do is, you know, figure out where these are. Also, another one that no one will ever talk about is, from a political point of view, how are these various people engaged? Like, is the head of IT completely opposed to this because he sees this as a threat? Not even from a necessarily, from a very understandable position of, he sees this as increasing his workload without getting any resources to actually achieve any of these goals, therefore get blamed. And also he can't even do what he's currently doing. So that's the other thing. The third point there is like the current business as usual. So how are we doing all these things? Like, what do we try to do? And then you kind of have to start thinking of, well, given that we know all this, like, what are we trying to do? And if we actually know where we are and we're pretty good to go, then it's essentially, there's what I said, like, it's a known outcome, right? It's to a certain extent, it's a known unknown, to go back to that, you know, the idea of knowledge and uncertainty and stuff. So this is probably I don't want to say this is the simplest and cheapest method, because that's not true at all, but there's a lot less uncertainty involved, because, you know, for example, okay, we have our data systems in place. We have, you know, we kind of have a fairly good single view of the customer system because that got implemented, or our vendor is providing it for free or whatever, or not for free, but, you know, as part out of the box, they kind of have it as part of the systems. We verified that to make sure that what the sales guys have told us is actually true. Because, you know, that's always a big kind of question is, yeah, they've told us this, but even if they thought they were telling the truth, the reality on IT for the vendor might be a bit different. Or maybe it's all home systems. So if you've got your own, but we know what we're trying to do. And we've kind of figured out that what we need to do is we need a better, let's say, customer lifetime value model for our customers, because we don't have really any clue who our valuable customers are. We figured that this is a major strategic weakness in our organization, and therefore we need to kind of implement that. Now, to a certain extent, that is a really well-defined problem, believe it or not, certainly compared to wherever I'm coming from. So you can treat that kind of like an IT project. Now, to say that that is like very simple is completely wrong, because as we said before, most IT projects fail. So, but at least like that, people kind of know how to build software properly now. The problem is most people aren't let do that, or the business culture prevents it from happening, or all sorts of other kind of reasons for why these things don't happen. But at least, you know, it's a relatively well-defined problem. You can start to put things like budgets and timeframes and outcomes and requirements and all that kind of stuff. You kind of know where you're going. And there's going to be bumps on the road, because you might not necessarily be capturing the data properly, and you might not, you know, you want to make sure that straight away. And, you know, there's a bunch of things that need to be done. But in most cases, this is done. And I'm not really going to talk about that scenario. This is kind of a scenario we want to get to later. But for now, if you've got that, then, you know, the rest of what I'm going to talk about probably isn't going to be as relevant, because in my experience, this scenario I'm describing here is relatively rare. Right? It's pretty common in like the big tech firms, like, you know, Facebook and Google and Amazon and all the big kind of names that are getting hammered in the stock market at the moment. Those companies generally have a pretty good IT infrastructure and a very kind of engineering mentality. So they generally have designed for this kind of scenario reasonably effectively, and they've monetized a lot of it already. So they, you know, they kind of have that. But in most organizations, especially with the more older sectors where they didn't just get invented in the last 20 years, you know, you're dealing with a more Byzantine structures in terms of IT, a mix of vendors, the data is in a bunch of different places. We don't even necessarily know what we're collecting, because it's been collected for a very different reason. It was very important 20 or 30 years ago, but it isn't now. But it's a very expensive system, so we're not really in a position to change it. And also, I mean, the other key thing is a lot of these organizations have realized this now, and they are going through, you know, relatively large IT transformation projects where they're trying to update a lot of this technology. So you don't necessarily want to fight that either, because A, it's a duplication of effort, but B, you kind of want to get on board with it, because that's the way things are going. And basically you're doomed to failure if you're fighting against the tide. So you kind of need to start to know all of them. So I'm going to talk a bit more about what I'm calling data science in the strictest sense of the term. And the reason why I wanted that is because the word science is in it, right? And this often gets forgotten about when people talk about this kind of stuff, is that the whole point of science is that we don't know stuff. It's the old joke of Dara Brian. Science knows it doesn't know everything, because if it did, it would just stop, right? So the whole point that we're dealing with science is that it's basically research. And when we're doing research, for some definition, there's an element of uncertainty. There's an element of a lack of knowledge. We're trying to find stuff out. So as a result, it doesn't really fit well into the more traditional corporate structure. Now, a lot of companies did have R&D in the past. That kind of got phased out over the last 30 or 40 years. But essentially, this is what these kind of things look at. You don't really know sometimes what you're going to find. In my experience, almost every company who has ever looked at this has found generally something quite valuable. It just might not necessarily be what they thought it would be. And I have a couple of anecdotes about that, like a little bit later when I basically run out with slides, and I'm just going to start talk anecdotes. But if that isn't kind of acknowledged and accepted and understood up front, then that's also where I have seen these things tend to fail, because from an internal budgeting and infrastructure point of view, it's very hard to not be able to it's very hard to try and get approval to a project where the ROI is essentially unknown, right? And I'm pretty sure it's positive, but I can't tell you what it is because I don't know what we're going to find. And that can be a very, very hard sell, which is why it's often not couched in that terms. It's couched in different ways. People make unrealistic promises, and then all those things come home to roost. And I know this because I've been there. I've been on the situations where, I've actually tried to put a bit of structure on this kind of stuff and answer these unanswerable questions, given some answers, told them that there was a margin of error around this, and then get hammered because the numbers I gave them were wrong, and you could kind of see it coming, and you're like, well, that's the way it is. And in most cases, certainly in my finance career, I just ended up parting ways. I was like, look, I could see this coming, and this isn't going to work, and I don't really care that this isn't, because I'm going to be here in 3 years' time, and I'm going to be no further along, and it's not really going to achieve anything. So it's very important to be kind of upfront about that. And maybe the best choice is to not do anything, because ultimately, if that money and time and effort and resources could be spent elsewhere, and that might be just going back, like figuring out an IT project. So going back to your data and going, well, one of the reasons we know is that our data is kind of crap. So let's make our data better. And rather than doing, a proper data project, instead we'll go down, we'll spend not much time, but we'll do a feasibility study and we'll improve all our data pipelining. So then it becomes an IT project, and again, it's a data engineering. We can put some very simple use cases for the data, and then we can start constructing these data pipelines, and we're back to the realm of, well, at least we have an idea of what we're getting out of it. As in, we'll have we're going to save time in terms of our reporting and whatever it needs to be, and we can kind of dress it up that way. But like I said, in most cases that isn't the case. So we want to get, we want to get a better idea of what our customers like, or we don't really know. We know, I have actually been asked by quite a few clients, we have a bunch of data, we kind of think there's value there, but we have no idea what we can do with it. Can you help us get some sense on it, right? And what do you do in that case? So the biggest problem with all of these projects is risk. And by that, I don't mean risk in the sense of selling insurance. I mean that kind of much more broader term of, it's entirely possible we're going to get nothing out of this, right? And to me, the best way to approach this is to be honest about that. So you kind of dress it up in terms of a lotto ticket or a bet, because people emotionally understand that. So you kind of dress it up as, we don't necessarily know that we're going to get anything back from this, but what we're doing is buying a lottery ticket. And we're buying a lottery ticket with what we think is positive expected value, or it's a good value bet. To go back to people were asking me a few weeks ago about how do you couch this stuff up where people who want to deal in the truth, and I just kind of go on that logic where you just now the key thing to that though is to try and minimize the cost for it. Let me see, am I at the end there? I am. It's very important though then, if that's kind of the way we think about it, what you want to do is de-risk as much as possible then, because it's entirely possible you end up with nothing. So I generally recommend people to not spend a crap ton of money upfront. Like, don't budget for a big project, budget for a small project and see where you are and assess it. Like, after my colleague has a manifesto that he's given to clients in the past, where, you know, we come up with, here's how we think you would do a data project. You would, here's where we want to be after a month, here's where we want to be after 3 months, here's where we want to be after 6 months. You've got regular checkpoints in the way. Here's how you need to do it, and here's how we to think about it. Now, the thing I would always say is, the important thing of all of this is, like any technology, or actually most things in the world these days, is it's important to get the right people in the right place. That's kind of the most important place to start. You kind of have to hire good people, and that can be very difficult, because basically you often need people that don't necessarily fit seamlessly into your corporate culture, because if they did fit seamlessly into your corporate culture, chances are you would have hired them already, and you would already be doing this stuff, right? So sometimes you actually need people that are going to be different, and again, that causes changes and it causes friction, because you get essentially mismatched expectations between the various people. So you kind of need to get people in who will do this. But I always tell people, I wouldn't actually hire permanent staff. I would hire people on contract. Get people on contract. You can quite often get very good people on contract. They look expensive because their day rates are quite high, but that's because they're very good at what they do and they're in demand. And therefore, you know, they've been able to survive without the regular paycheck. There's Nassim Taleb, who, I can't remember if I mentioned him in the uncertainty one. He has, he's the guy who wrote The Black Swan and Fooled by Randomness and stuff. And he talks a lot about kind of how people misunderstand probability and statistics. But he has a great phrase about how the 3 most addictive substances known to man are heroin, carbohydrates, and the monthly pay packet. And that's of all the things he has said that I agree with, that's probably the most profound statement he's ever made. Most people, and I've seen it happen loads of times, especially in the startup world, where I've seen loads of people who have toyed with the idea of, like, making the jump, quitting their job and taking a punt with a startup, and they get cold feet and they pull out at the last minute, because the idea of not getting that regular amount of money into their account every month just kind of gives them the willies. They don't see how and these would be very incredibly employable. So, like, to my attitude as well, the reason why I always find it a bit weird is because these are people who could very easily just go do a startup for a year. There's no way they'd lose their employability. In fact, if anything, it would probably enhance their career prospects. But for whatever reason, just that psychological break of doing this. So contractors are kind of like, I mean, they're kind of a halfway house, right? They don't have that regular employment guarantee, because they tend to change jobs every 6 months, 12 months, whatever. They don't necessarily want to work in a corporate culture permanently, but they do tend to be quite accomplished just by their nature, because if they didn't, they would have taken a permanent job, because it's too hard for them to get hired. And they generally have a good network of people and stuff. So I would generally recommend that you look to try and hire people on a short-term basis, and, you know, and kind of get, you know, starts very small, hire 1 or 2 people on a contract basis, 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, like whatever you think it needs to be. I wouldn't worry too much about the day rate. A lot of people do, but, like, you know, I don't want to talk about day rates, because to be honest, I don't know what it's like in Ireland. But, you know, expect to pay, you know, a senior IT developer kind of day rates. And that's always going to change, but you'll get someone. You know, it's not easy to find them, but if you're serious about it and you give the right conditions, in most cases, in my experience, people who are senior care more about their working conditions than they do about the actual, like, as long as the money is right, like, because the money is kind of the same no matter where they go, right? What they care about is where they're going. So as long as you kind of give them the conditions to do what they need to do, they will generally deliver. And, you know, the other benefit is you can probably get references of people, or, you know, Ireland's kind of small, right? So it's generally people will become recommended by other people. I know that's technically not always allowed now under employment law, so I'm not quite sure. That's a bit of a grey area now, I think, although maybe it's not even the law. It might be just professional bodies that are very reluctant to follow references and stuff like that. But you know, you can do it. But the key thing is start small with relatively modest, well-defined goals for what you want to achieve at first. And then, you know, so you have a very limited scope. Tend to focus, I would generally recommend people focus on, like, data extracts. So, like, stuff that you might, if you're in finance or insurance or whatever, there's generally a bunch of relatively well-defined data extracts from your business that you produce on a regular basis as a result of like regulatory reporting, or like as counted, like whatever, or maybe as part, if you're a vendor, as part of your SLAs, you have to produce reports. I would generally start with those kind of data sets for a couple of reasons, but the big one is they're already kind of somewhat cleaned, and they're in a relatively well-known and well-understood format, even if they're not necessarily being produced for the purpose that you're now putting them to. So you don't have to then dig deep into a whole load of other like areas where you end up with a data engineering project and 6 months and not really getting anything out of it, right? I tend to like, if there are relatively easily to access data sets that you can get access to, that is generally where I would start, even if it's not necessarily directly relevant to the kinds of things you're wanting to do. And that goes into the limited scope. Quite often, the thing I will tell people to do is the first deliverable is figuring out what the deliverables will be. And now I know that's a bit meta, but to me, quite often it's so up in the air where most people just don't really know what they want. They just figure there's something they should be doing and there's some value they can get. That's what I will tell people. I'll just say, look, like, let's come up with a deliverable in 2 weeks, a month, whatever needs to be done. And then we'll kind of figure out what you can do after that. But I don't really know up front because I have no idea what your data looks like. So I could tell you I'll give you timelines, but to be honest, I'm just lying to you, because it might turn around after a couple of days and it finds out it's completely impossible what I thought would be trivial to do because of whatever way the data was collected. And you don't really know that. You can't know that. And no amount of meetings, no amount of even prep work can really dictate that. The only way you find this stuff out is to spend a few weeks on a project trying to determine it. It's the only way you find out. And certainly in my experience anyway, and any person I've ever met in the business who comes to the meetups and stuff like that, I don't think anyone has ever argued with me, and I would know because we argue about bloody everything, right? But that's kind of one of the universal, if I was wrong on that, someone would have challenged me on it by now. But that is typically, you can't, because there's too many unknowns and there's too many uncertainties, and you can only really start to articulate the possibilities once you've actually started trying to do stuff with it, because that's when basically all the rakes appear. That's when you just start stepping into the slightly overgrown grass, and sometimes there's a rake and sometimes there isn't. And the only way you know really is to actually just step into the grass. But the final point also is experimentation. You kind of need to have kind of an experimentation kind of philosophy. You need to try a few things and see what works and see what doesn't work. And, just create your data visualizations, start asking questions, bring in the stakeholders who will also kind of show them what you've done. They'll tell you if it's right or wrong. The attitude I always take on that is I always do something. And then, because people in my experience are much more happy, rather than tell you what they want, if you try and tell them something and it's wrong, they will tell you it's wrong. And you can kind of get feedback from them that way. So quite often it can be quite hard to ask someone what they want, or to how do you go about doing this? They don't really give you a good answer. So if I start making assertions about things and I'm wrong, people will correct me. And it doesn't even have to be a negative experience. Like, it's not like they're telling me I'm an idiot. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it's just like, no, that actually doesn't make sense. And I'm like, well, why? And they'll go, because X, Y, Z. And then you're starting to learn about it. So I would get the focus, like, not to sit around but just to start getting the data, putting some shape on stuff, start asking questions about it. Just do simple things like plotting it, and do all the stuff that we talked about over the last few weeks. Like, don't build machine learning models or anything like that. Maybe fit a few regression lines or something, but like, don't go down the route of building a whole load of crap, even though it's relatively easy to do, because you've no idea what you're building, and it's probably going to lead you down a blank alley. What you really want to start doing is, are there a whole lot of weird values is there this long tail in the sector, like the company sector, the client sector, that we didn't really realize existed? And we thought, like, well, this goes back, I think I've told this story I've told this story loads of times. I'm presuming I've mentioned it here before, where there was a company that did an analysis of all their claims, and they found out that 60% of the claims came from accountants. And when they looked into it deeper, they realized that accountant was the first entry in the drop-down box, and their claims handlers weren't really paying attention to it. So, finding out all those kind of things are really, really important. and you don't really find them out until you start trying it. So kind of build that into the plan. And again, this, you've got to accept that, you know, you might end up spending a bunch of money and not really getting a whole lot in return, because you find out not necessarily that the project was a failure, but you find out that the data isn't there, or it's going to require you to change too much. Like, you'll find out, actually, there's these things we could do with our data, but it would involve completely reinventing our customer relationship process. And that's just too big of a bite to take, and we just can't do it. So at that point, there's not much point in continuing, right? Or maybe, you know, because it's just not going to work, because we're, you know, our entire organization is geared to be looking this direction, and you're telling us we have to take a 90-degree angle for this to work. So therefore, like, let's just not bother. Like I said, you come up with a very small team. The reason for that, you want a small number of reasonably senior and experienced people to work on this, and that can be internal or external. It needs to be dedicated to this though. So there's no way, you can't turn around and start telling people, this is a great idea, you need to do this in addition to your normal job, because resources need to be allocated to this. And that can be in terms of budget, it can be in terms of time, it can be in terms of money, however you want to do it. But actual resources, there needs to be skin in the game from the organization, like I don't want to say a senior level, but at a decision-making level, and at a power level, where they have to have some kind of skin in the game. Otherwise, it doesn't matter, right? It's like, well, a great example is this meetup, right? I mean, for this talk series, and I do this myself with free meetups, right? People sign up because there's nothing in it. You're going to get a lot better turnover if even you paid 5 or 10 quid to show up, right? Because I've spent money now. Whereas if it's a free, you just don't value it. This exact same principle applies here. Like, some money and resources and time and some kind of currency needs to have been spent for this to succeed. And like I said there, the flexible goals are really important. You don't necessarily want to be too prescriptive going in about what we're trying to achieve here. In many cases, like, if people really have no idea, I'll just say, all right, well, look, let's just start taking a look at some data and let's have a couple of conversations, and then we'll probably figure that out along the way. And that's kind of how, you know, it works. And, you know, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And that's kind of the balance that I found. So that's kind of all the slides I want to do. And I'm going to say it's an example, but it probably should be examples. But even then, I've worked for a whole bunch of people in the last 10, 15 years. And I don't really want to get into too much detail about any of them, because, you know, in some cases that work was confidential, but I'm happy to give kind of an amalgam of anecdotes about kind of things we found. And like I said, being brutally honest, in most cases, like, I can only really think of one organization. Like, I've worked out, my hit rate will be 10 as well for this. Like in a lot of cases, the project itself was reasonably successful in terms of actually achieving outcomes, and the client was relatively happy at the end of it. But I can't necessarily point at very many organizations that then went on to actually start achieving, you know, high success. Ironically, I was talking to one of my colleagues this morning. Our biggest successes have been very clearly people who wanted to collaborate with us, and then everything went quiet, and then 6 months later they were producing products that looked remarkably like the things we were discussing building with them. That's probably been our biggest successes. I can think of at least 3 off the top of my head where that has occurred. And, you know, but in terms of actual companies that have done it, a few have though. And in a couple of cases, they were very happy, but they kind of realized the work just went into a drawer, because it would have just involved, literally, there was one meeting, I wasn't in it, my colleague was, where they just said, we just have to change, you know, we just have to change too much about how we conduct with our customer base. And that's just, our system just isn't set up for that. So therefore we're not going to do it. And they're like, okay, fair enough. I mean, to me, I remember when it happened at the time, I was really annoyed, because I was like, but you can actually make a lot more money that way. But, you know, you're essentially blowing up a pretty large part of your company on the off chance of success. So, you know, I'm not necessarily going to criticize with the benefit of a bit more age and wisdom. I it was probably the right decision, because, you know, at some point you just have to accept that the world isn't perfect, and, you know, now that we've known, and sometimes the right decision is just not to do anything, you know. And it's there's this, again, going back to human psychology, when there is a problem, there is this human attitude to try and fix it, but quite often the attempt of fixing it just makes things worse. So it's like a bit like the whole Hippocratic oath thing of first do no harm, which, you know, a lot of doctors haven't really adhered to as much in the past, certainly much more better in recent memory. But like Andrew, I think it was Andrew Garfield, he was shot, he was the US president, he was shot by an anarchist, and he died from the infection by the surgeon went in there with the dirty hands and basically was looking for the wound and put his hands into the wound, and he actually died 10 days later from like a massive internal infection and blood disease and all that kind of stuff. So, you know, sometimes you're better off just not doing anything, because it's very emotionally unsatisfying, but it's actually the right call to make. And, you know, part of what I would say about that project is kind of dictating, like trying to figure that out. Like, is this, like, can we get away with doing something small and kind of building this stuff up incrementally? Can our organization, like, essentially what happens is you're going to end up with software development principles within your organization. Can our organizational structure account for that? Because quite often it's a very different personality type with a much more, like, with an engineering mindset, like, say, generally speaking, we lack social skills. I'm not going to argue that. You know, there's a whole load of, anyone who's ever worked with a bunch of dev people will know exactly what I'm talking about. You know, we pretty much invented the culture wars 20 years ago. You know, unfortunately, all those idiots online just kind of metastasized into the culture as a whole. You know, that all this kind of stuff. So handling that personality type is a challenge, and some organizations have done very well at it, even within insurance. I can think of a few off the top of my head, but others it hasn't worked out at all. And, you know, basically they spent a fortune. I know a couple of US insurers who like had data science functions that were like in the millions of dollars of an annual budget, and they all got scaled back, and they're much more, I think they ended up getting subsumed into actuarial afterwards, even though they were very deliberately set up apart. So that's kind of, you know, so, okay, so that's kind of all the stuff I want to talk about. I'm going to try and give a couple of examples. Before I do, though, I'll just check, are there any questions? I don't think there are. Oh, yeah, sorry. Thank you, David. That is exactly correct. So you just said that's called Agile. So Agile, the Agile manifesto and that whole Agile approach to data science doesn't really work in that sense, in terms of there's no point in trying to apply what's called the Agile methodology for software development. It doesn't really work for data stuff. And I know because I've been on the business end of it, and it just doesn't work correctly. It doesn't really fit, for the simple reason that you don't really have good, but I didn't mention to say that, but the philosophy is the same. It's very much an Agile philosophy, but without the Agile methodology, if you understand. Because so just for those of you who aren't aware of Agile, it's kind of this big buzzword. It's been around for quite a while. A lot of places have tried to adopt it. Most have completely failed, because it requires pretty strict and specific ways to do things that generally, I don't say they will work, but they have a pretty good chance of succeeding if you apply them properly. But like a lot of buzzwords, they end up get kind of changed, and people throw out the parts they don't really like, even though they're the parts that, while difficult, are the reasons why it succeed in the first place. So you end up with this mess of stuff. But the whole idea is that you come up with user requirements and what are called a user story, which is kind of like a functional requirement. And then you split your work up into 2 or 3 week sprints, and then you kind of make a delivery, and then you have these daily stand-ups. And at the end of every couple of weeks, you either, you know, you've got a bunch of functionality finished off, and then you turn around and you start the process over and over again. And, you know, there's a few key components to it. That philosophy is definitely one I would espouse for this kind of approach, but it doesn't necessarily fit very well into that whole 2 to 3 week sprint, because quite often you just don't know what you're doing, and you have no idea how you're going to get there, and you can't really put a user story around it. You don't really know. All you can kind of give is a very short-term thing of, well, I'm going to do this. So the stand-ups I found were very useful, and we do a daily stand-up now, and we try to keep it as quickly as possible. So like that whole level of communication throughout is really, really useful. And even chunking things up into work can be useful, but trying to put things into user stories and expressing things in terms of hours and stuff, I never did that. I used to get the few times I did Agile, I used to irritate the Scrum Master because I just refused to put things into hours, because the best thing I could do was a day and a half day. So I would say, I'm going to spend half a day on this, I'm going to spend a day on this, and I don't know where I'm going, and I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm going to get something out of it. I just don't know when. And after a while, because I managed to build up a bit of trust, because I have a reasonable amount of technical proficiency, that once I said I would do something, I was generally fairly good at delivering it, even if it wasn't necessarily what like we were expecting to do. But I was pretty good at bracketing things into, but I just never went, because they wanted like in half an hour or an hour or something like that. And I was just like, I have no idea. It could take me 10 minutes or it could take me 3 days. I won't know. And I won't know, like, I'll know pretty quickly if it's going to take me 15 minutes. But if I'm 2 hours in, I still might not necessarily know if it's going to be a day or if I'm going to have it done in an hour or two, because these things are very, very opaque, and it's very, very hard to understand this kind of stuff until you get into it. So that's why I have found that while the whole flexible philosophy and approach and the daily stand-up is a great idea, the overall agile like methodology doesn't really work well for this, purely because the outcomes are just so uncertain, and it's just too hard to put time frames on specific tasks. But yes, thank you for reminding me. I actually meant to bring that up. I thought of that this morning, that kind of what I'm describing is kind of like agile, but it doesn't quite work for this kind of stuff, even though it looks like it should. In my experience, it typically, and I thought that was just me being a difficult and uncooperative. But I've spoken to, again, a bunch of people who come to like the Dublin Data Science meetup who are reasonably experienced, and their experience has been quite similar to mine. That when you try to kind of pin us down to like relatively well defined, what in software terms would be a 2 or 3 hour job or a 4 hour job or a day's job, we don't really know, because we don't really know what we're even going to do, and it'll depend on what, like, starting it, and then we'll have a sense after a while. But in advance, it's just too hard to guess. But thank you for that. Thank you for that reminder of that. Yeah, so Colin, the 2.73 was recently reported the time multiplication difference between time estimates and reality. So there's a thing called Hofstadter's law, which is that things take a lot longer than you expect them to take, even when you account for Hofstadter's law. So I have which, and that's totally true, because the human brain is really, really good at abstracting away difficult things to do. And it's only when you actually think about how I'm going to do it that we realize, oh, wait, this is a lot more complicated than I realized it was. And my brain just didn't think of all these kind of weird edge cases that I now have to think through, and therefore it's going to take me a lot longer to and even knowing that going in, I have always, as a rule of thumb, whenever I would go, if I was trying to estimate how long something would take, I would usually go with whatever my estimate is and multiply it by 3. And often I would underestimate. And sometimes that ends up with, just, it's not worth doing. But, okay, this is going to be 20 days off the top of my head. Well, therefore it's probably going to be 60, because there's all these other things you haven't thought about that are now going to appear very, very quickly, and they just mean it takes a lot longer to do. But yeah, I'm interesting to see that. To be honest, I would have thought it was higher than that. That's interesting that it's less than 3, because if I had to guess, I would have said in advance somewhere between 3x and 5x. And that's even in software. That's not just data stuff. So in data stuff where you have a lot more kind of uncertainty, it's a very, very hard way to kind of estimate what we're going to do. How are we doing for time? Well, about 10 minutes left. So yeah, so basically, typically the way I would kind of give a couple of examples without getting into too specifically, like I've worked for quite a few financial institutions. In the last 10 years, it's mainly been insurance, but there's been a few others. And typically, it's very, very rare where I've had a situation where someone has came to, now it might be different when you're an employee within an organization. Typically not, though, from what I've told people, but I will kind of couch that. Typically people don't really know what they want. So when they ask me they will just say, you know, we think we've got some data. Where would you start? What would you do? And, you know, I always say this. I always say, look, we don't really know where we're going. This might not be suitable. So the best thing to do is to just ring fence a small section of time and a small amount of, you know, a reasonably small amount of money. And then let's see, like, let's just take it from there. I would be very, very reluctant to go too short a time. Like typically, if it was me, like when people come to me, I would be very, very reluctant to do less than 10 days. You can do less than that. From a corporate project point of view, I would say at least a month and maybe two, because you just have more hurdles to overcome in terms of IT and, you know, internal transfers and making things organized. But you have to have dedicated time to it. This cannot be done in addition to an existing job. I heard a very, very funny story of a reasonably well-known insurer, let's just say in the British Isles. I don't want to say if it was UK, Ireland, Scotland, or Wales or wherever. I will guarantee all of you have heard the name. Certainly if you know anything about insurance. But they had an issue where they wanted to get a single view of the customer, and basically they were told, like, I think they got quotes from IT, or a lot of these companies have outsourced their IT, so the whole thing becomes a mess, becomes outrageously expensive. And there was a guy, I don't even know the guy's name, because this isn't a person I know. The person I was told this from a person who knows this individual. So immediately it's, you know, it's a friend of a friend. They went, you know what, I actually know how to do this, and this has been annoying. So in his own time, let's call him John, went off and basically built this, essentially a little bit, it was more of a proof of concept, but he basically built like a toy illustration of how to combine a bunch of different like internal systems to create this. I think it was a single view of the customer. I'm not even sure what it was, to be honest. It was something like that though. Anyway, he then showed it to like more senior management, and they thought, wow, this is absolutely brilliant. This is going to change how we do things. This is great. This is far too important for John to work on. So he's out, and we're going to put this senior person who's very important politically in charge of the project. And you can imagine where it went. 6 months later, like nothing got done. And John, who, you know, had the temerity to show some initiative, got completely disillusioned. I think he ended up leaving the company after a while, because he was not only was his work taken off him, he wasn't allowed to work on it anymore. He was also shown in no uncertain terms that he was really not important to that organization. So I like when and I hear that a lot, like some individuals within organizations will show initiative, and they're not, it's not malicious, but it's the way the corporate politics and the way the internal dynamics work. They are very clearly disincentivized from ever repeating that mistake ever again. And you really don't want to encourage that. And the other way I've heard is, the other way around is, someone says, this is absolutely brilliant. Yeah, we totally want you to work on that, but you need to do that in addition to your day job. So your reward for actually doing something interesting and of benefit to the company is actually to get more work for less pay, for, you know, for the same amount of pay. And again, that's not particularly incentivizing either. If this is a project that's totally worth doing, what you actually need to do is carve some time out. And that was actually what the whole famous Google 20% time that people always talk about and is often completely like misdescribed. That was always their idea. What they were trying to say was, we will account for 4 days of your week for your business as usual, and then you have 1 day a week where you can work on a side project that will be of value to Google. It wasn't like you could go off and develop a video game or anything. The idea was to give people the space to develop ideas, which is where Gmail came from, and a whole bunch of it. Now, the flip side of that is Google is notorious for creating products and then canning them, you know, a year later or whatever like that. There's, you know, you can't really rely on anything Google have produced, even the really good stuff. Like I loved Google Reader. I thought Google Reader was amazing, and they just decided, nah, not shifting the needle enough. You know, if it's not making billions and billions, then it's not really affecting our bottom line. So it doesn't. So, you know, but again, you have to kind of be aware of that within your culture. One last Google story. I'm conscious of that, but to try and again, and my apologies if I've told this story already, but they've done a bunch of projects, but one of them I thought was great was there was a woman who was hired to basically implement some technology that was like bridging a couple of different systems, and she was given a bunch of FTAs, or FTEs, sorry, and a budget and like a year's time or 2 years to do the project. And basically, I think she was 6 months into the project and she'd spent half her budget, and the whole thing had turned into grey goo, and it was just completely impossible. She discovered that what they were trying to do was not feasible with the technologies they were using, or the data wasn't being collected properly. There was some basically fundamental flaw in the approach that wasn't really retrievable. So it was dead in the water. So she thought, oh crap, I'm getting fired. And when she went in and reported to it, she was actually thanked by senior management. And the reason why they thanked her was that they'd accepted that it was failed, that it couldn't be done. They looked at what she said and they accepted her reasons that, yes, you're absolutely correct. What you're trying to do isn't feasible. But they were glad because they had rather than the 2 years and the 2 million quid that they budgeted for it, it had only taken 6 months and half the money. So they saw that as spent money that they were getting back, as opposed to wasting 6 months and $1 million. And I think this is the point I'm trying to make about these cultures. For these kind of highly uncertain outcomes to be achievable, you kind of have to be willing to accept that, because it's the age-old joke about marketing, right? That half your marketing budget is wasted. The only problem is we don't know which half, right? And that is, that's exactly the same. We know that a lot of this stuff isn't going to work, or isn't going to be work the way we do, but sometimes you get magic from it. And just to give another quick story before we end on the side of it, we basically were doing some work for a customer again in the UK on lapsing business. It was life insurance based and lapsing, policies, because especially with the downturn and all that, a lot of people, because the house prices fell and all that, people were getting rid of their life insurance mortgage, and there was a lot of costs involved in that. So they were quite concerned about their lapse rate. And they were basically, it wasn't even trying to get better predictions. They were just trying to understand what the drivers of lapsing was. So they got us in to do this work. And basically, while we were doing this, there was a bunch of other things going on. So while we were waiting on data, or we would have these natural lulls in the project, we looked at a few other side ones. And one of them was basically we discovered geospatial stuff. So we actually found that because these customers had home addresses, we could actually put them on a map. And as a result, then we found that there was the census data. So because we could leverage open source information, we ended up being able to create like geospatial maps of the UK and Ireland based on census data. Now, it was different in both cases because, the data is slightly differently, but even though they're telling you similar things, they're going about it in slightly different ways. And that just came out of a side thing because we were kind of waiting for something to happen. I think we had like a week or two, and we're like, well, I'm not going to sit here and do nothing. I may as well do something. There's this thing we've been talking about for a while. Let's take a look at it. And as a result, the company ended up being able to not just look at, now they ended up not using, to my knowledge, they ended up not using it for lapsing. The work ended up being using as a broker relationship. So basically they knew that some of their brokers were essentially churning their customers just to get commissions. But they didn't really have, they kind of knew it anecdotally, but they didn't have any hard quantitative evidence that they could use in meetings to arm, staff like negotiators with. So as a result, it was that a combination of the geospatial modeling, the churning, and a couple of other things we had done. Even though it ended up not being useful in terms of what they were trying to do, they ended up like largely cutting out an awful lot of the toxic business that they were getting. That was basically just brokers exploiting their systems. So as long as you're willing to take these kind of relatively open attitudes and be willing to accept that what you want might not be what you get, as long as you're willing to accept that what you get is probably going to be valuable, that to me is the way you these projects only ever work. Yeah. So I've just noticed we came right up at the time. I had a funny feeling my ability to blather for half an hour would last that one screen with example on there. So yeah. So anyway, that's kind of me for the day. We're kind of done for most of the content. So what I'm planning on doing for the final one is to just kind of come up with a summary. And again, the Tony Blair manifesto of, I'm going to just keep repeating myself until people, when I'm totally sick of it, people finally start listening. And yeah, so next week, I'm just going to kind of go over the seven weeks that we did, talk about some various, and much more importantly, if people have any questions or comments or things they would like to get my take on, it's a perfect example to deal with that. But yeah, I will leave it there. I don't think there was any questions in the chat. There was a couple of comments that I saw. But if anyone else has any questions, by all means, I'm going to be here for another couple of minutes. But yeah, other than that, I'm done. Back to you, Damien.
Thanks very much, Mick. That was great. Always a fascinating subject there when they're talking about changing systems and the escalating commitments around patching legacy systems.
It's you know, it's not a trivial problem, and but to my knowledge, you have to learn that quickly, and then decide, is the juice going to be worth the squeeze? And it might not be. It just might not be worth doing.
Yeah, and you have those horror stories like with Ulster Bank when their system fell over and people can't get money out of ATMs for a number of weeks.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think Ulster Bank just happened to be the ones it happened to. I've heard that most banking systems are, as you know, it's generally, you know, baling twine and prayers. Yeah. A bit of chewing gum in the right places.
Yeah, but if anyone has any questions, pop them in the chat there now. But other than that, as I said, I think we'll leave it there and we'll pick it up next week. As Mick said, he's going to do a summary. And by all means, if you want something covered, drop any of us.
Please just drop me a mail, or Damien, or anyone.
Yeah.
I mean, we've got a lot of time next week. So if there's anything specific people would like me to cover again or expand upon something, please do. I'm more than happy to use that time for that.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, everyone, for your time. And we'll pick it up there next week. I hope to see as many of you as you can. Thanks, Maine, for your time.
Thanks, guys.